Thank you everybody for coming on this beautiful day, and obviously you all remember to turn your clocks ahead. I would like to talk today about the relocation of Quabbin houses, and let's see. If anybody in the back cannot hear me, please raise your hand and I'll try to keep speaking as loudly as I can. Some people are behind the walls over there. I don't have a microphone, so you're going to have to rely on my vocal cords here. The first thing I'd like to talk about is a true Quabbin house versus a Quabbin house. And a true Quabbin house is one that is moved with board for board, numbered or chalked from a Quabbin location and reconstructed board for board at another location. We often hear about people saying, oh, that's a Quabbin house, or that's a Quabbin house. Yes, they're Quabbin houses, but my definition, and this is my personal opinion, are houses dubbed Quabbin that have been architecturally designed, using designated materials from Quabbin houses. And we'll learn more about this as we go on. But again, this is my personal opinion, and we will see both in my presentation. The MDC did a great job of mapping all of the towns, the roads, the location of the houses. They also photographed every house, barn, business, and for the most part, they are located here as well as in Boston. But there are plenty of sheets. This is only a portion of one showing the location of houses. I'd like to first talk about the Gass family. He was a contractor, and William Senior Gass was a carpenter. He went through all the stages of journeyman to become a master carpenter. He had 3 sons, Bill, and Bill started working with his father at age 14. He never had any formal schooling, but had a drawing board, a T-square, a camera, or a brush, and because his mind was on architecture, he was able to design these houses, and some of which I will show you today. Herbert was the mason, and it said that he could build a chimney that really had a draw. We'll see some of his work too. Robert was also the youngest member of the family, and the family decided that Robert should get an education. He should go to college. Well, Robert came home on vacation, and he came down the next morning in his overalls and said, I'm ready to go to work with the family. And he eventually became the master carpenter of the group. This is the first board for board or true Quabbin house that I encountered. The house on the left is from the DCR here, from MDC Records, which will, all the houses that you will see for comparison are from them. And the house on your right is the house as it stands in Amherst. This is, on the left, is the home of James Patterson. We've done a deed search on this house, and I haven't gone back to Springfield to finish the deed search, but anyway, we know that it was occupied by James Patterson. It was also occupied by Noah Merrick, and in 1823 it was sold to a gentleman called Captain Levi Wickman Lumbar. He was a sea captain, and he bought this house, did another journey, went off to Paris, brought back some wallpaper which he put in the house, and when the Gasses bought this house in 1938, the wallpaper was still on the Quabbin house, apparently in pretty good condition. At any rate, they numbered all the boards in this house, they took it down, they transported it to Amherst. And it was primarily Robert who reconstructed this house in 1938, and he married an Anne Gillian from Northampton and gave this house to his wife as her wedding present. What a wonderful wedding present. At any rate, in the front, at the front steps, you'll see a granite slab that is also from Quabbin. It comes from Mary Walker's house in Greenwich. And she was a very interesting person also in that she was a surgeon in the Civil War. She wore a hat, she had short cropped hair, and she eventually got the Medal of Honor. That's a very interesting story if anybody is interested in women's lives. I was invited into this house. I've been in the house several times, and this is the living room. One of the things that you see in many of these Quabbin houses are these paneled walls, beautiful paneled walls, and I'm sure that Herbert probably built the fireplace in this house. And I'm told by the owner that Anne Gass cooked stews on a pot, which you can't see, I'm sorry, my picture isn't all that great, in the fireplace. I'm sure she probably also used the bake oven. At any rate, this house is very, very well maintained, in beautiful condition. I'm told by the young lady who grew up in this house that Mr. Gass, the Gass family, also put up these houses, and there's supposedly 3. So my guess is on a little street. One of the characteristics of the Gass family was that they used red paint. And I also find that oftentimes these are barns, and there are some granite steps here. I do not know for sure. In my research, I have not found out whether this is also one of Gass's houses. And to the right of the first house that we saw, I was on a back street and I turned around and I looked at this house and I said, oh my goodness, that certainly looks like a Quabbin house with the small windows. I've learned since that this addition on the right-hand side was put on. I talked to Elizabeth Pierce at the Swift River Valley Historical Society. She said, no, Jackie, this isn't a Quabbin house because of this. This is the addition. But there certainly are characteristics of a Quabbin house. And now I know that it was called Colonial Knoll. So those 5 houses in a cluster in Amherst are all either well, the one is a true Quabbin house, but these are Quabbin houses with materials from Quabbin. I had a friend who lived in this house in the same vicinity, and I called her up and I said, hey, do you live in a Quabbin house? And she said, no, Jackie, the only thing that I know of from Quabbin, is this granite step. And there are quite a few granite steps all around the region. I know in Harkness Road in Pelham, that there are a number in a garden up there. This is my second true Quabbin house, and this came from Enfield. The picture on your left was found at the Swift River Historic Society, and this is the home of Reverend Joshua Crosby. I surmise this may be he standing in front of the house. When the MDC bought all the houses in the Quabbin area for the project, this is what the house looked like. It was owned at that time by Simon Frenzy from Enfield. It was moved to Amherst, and this is what it looks like on Lincoln Avenue in Amherst. Reverend Crosby is a very interesting minister in that he lived in the house for 49 years. He preached to the people, the Enfield Congregational Church. He was very much liked. I'm told that this is the interior of the house, and I have met some people who were fortunate enough when this was the King house. I should back up a little bit. President King from Amherst College bought this house in 1939 in January. and he was president at the college, and he and his wife wanted a house to retire to. So they bought this one. I'm sure Bill Gass probably put it together. Mr. King was president at the college during the Depression years and brought the college through the Depression. And this house, Mrs. King, liked to entertain. So I did meet somebody who actually was entertained with her children in this house. And I was told that on the hall wall there was always a picture hanging of Reverend Crosby, and this is he. He was he definitely was a very distinguished man in that he had long gray hair, he had a prominent nose, blue eyes, and he always wore his silk robes in the pulpit as well as in the summertime when he visited his parishioners. Let's see. This is a Quabbin house designed by Bill Gass. This is also in Amherst. The people who had bought this house had only had it a few months when I was actually invited inside. The previous people had put an addition on, which really doesn't impinge upon the front of the house, and these are the clapboards that you often find. I'll talk a little bit about these windows later on. Inside the house in the dining room from Quabbin are these shelves and cupboards in the dining room. In the hall, we can see the Quabbin doors with the old latches and the hinges. And in their dining room, the windows that we looked at the front, I was told that this was a very dark room, and the previous people put in the windows so that it would be light and bright. But at the same time, we can see the beams in the ceiling. And also, I said we'd talk about Herbert's masonry work, and the house sits on fieldstone that I'm sure he probably put together with his masonry work. The third house that I understand is in Quabbin, board for board, is this house. I have not been able to make contact with the family, haven't learned too much about the house, but if you look at in Quabbin and the garage, there are garage doors here. It's pretty much as it was. No matter what house they bought, there was always some alteration here or there with windows or something. This house will go to Pelham, was from Prescott, and it was the Charles Abbott house. It was built, I believe, in 1722, and in 1822, I'm sorry, and in 1877, Charles Abbott bought the house, and a number of generations of the Abbotts lived in this house. This has a very interesting story in that the Mr. and Mrs. were married. They had no house to live in. They were living in Pelham in an apartment, and they wanted a house. And a few doors down from them in Pelham lived Charles Walker, and he was the man who was responsible to the MDC to sell the houses. I understand in further reading that I believe it was his father that appraised many of the houses in Quabbin. At any rate, they went into Quabbin, they selected this house. He was director of intramural sports at Amherst College, so he had access to his students. And he took his students and anybody else that wanted to come. They numbered the boards in this house and brought them back to Amherst. It was now getting on to fall. It was really too late. And the other problem was they had no place to put this house. So all the boards were stored in a barn for the winter. And then what happened? We had the hurricane of 1938. This was 1938 when they bought it. So the next year, everybody got to work cleaning up the chestnut trees and whatever else was blown down by the hurricane. They built some fences, and the first fence was a Virginia rail fence, and it goes down to the ground. And Mr. couldn't get his lawnmower underneath there, and that bothered him because he was very meticulous. He liked big projects. Oh, in the meantime, they bought this huge piece of property, and they had to change it then to a split rail fence so that he could get his mower underneath it. He bought a small house, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture, which stands to the left over here, where the boys or whoever helped him reconstruct this house, and Mrs. cooked the meals and brought them over from Pelham, and they put up the framing, and all of a sudden he realized he loved big projects, but he didn't know how he was going to do the interior of this house. So they hired a contractor, Max Goldenbush from Belchertown, and he did the interior for them. The interior is not as it was in Quabbin, but adapted for the current living. At any rate, once the house was built, Mrs. Lumley had given him lilacs for his birthday, and they were doing very well. And now he was ready for another project. So he amassed some soil, took it to Mass Aggie, and he came back saying, "This is great property for growing your lilacs." So this is the lilac farm up in Pelham on Harkness Road. And he planted lilacs. He had 300 varieties of lilacs on that land, and it was the largest private collection in the world. The picture on the right is the barn that he bought in 1944 that he brought to the property. I'm sorry, the wisteria, they cut it down the following year, but I just had to show you because it was beautiful. I hope it will come back. Also in Belchertown, I just wanted to show you some houses. This is on Federal Street. This one is on Sargent Street. I haven't had time to do the research on these houses, but I also wanted you to know that not only Belchertown, as we go forward, also in Leverett, they moved houses to New York, Vermont. There are houses in Ware, in Munson. I mean, I just learned that there's some in West Brookfield. There's a cottage up on Lake Wyola. It's very exciting. There's so many houses. Anyway, this was one of the most exciting houses that I've researched. This is the barn from Rose and John Bowden. And this part of the house, this is how it stands up in Leverett. This part of the house was added in 1950 by, guess who? Bill Gass. At any rate, the woman who bought this house originally, Mrs. Fallon, had kept all of the historic information, how they bought this house. And I would like to read to you because it's not very clear up there. This was July 13th, 1934. Dear Mrs. Fallon, the commission approved the arrangement I made with you for the sale of the old barn at Shaft 12 for the sum of $25. It is understood that you will remove this barn within a month and the property will be left free from rubbish. Well, we as women are allowed to change our minds, right? So, in August 20th, 1934, dear Mrs. Fallon, the commission has approved the arrangement I made with you to change the sale of the E.T. King barn in Greenwich to the Rose A. and John Bowden barn in Prescott. You to pay $25 more for the Bowden barn. And it's very exciting because this is the signature of Charlie Walker. And he said, P.S. I think it advisable that I go to this farm with you so that there will be no mistake. at any rate, it's wonderful to see the signature and to see primary documents. I was invited into this house and was shown around. And in the basement, on the original house, you see the failstone that's here. Chester Woodard was the contractor who brought this house back board for board from Quabbin, the barn. And when Mr. Gass put the addition on, this is the connection that he made between the old fieldstone and the new full basement that they have underneath the addition. And I was told that all through the property, when they dig, they find these bricks. And so, again, being very frugal, I'm sure that Mr. Gass used these as well as cement bricks for the foundation of the addition in the 50s. Let's see. This is inside. They're a little dark, but if you stand in the lower part of the living room, you can see a balcony up here, and on either side there's a lovely bedroom. This is a fireplace with the board at least 18 inches that's supporting the mantel. If we go upstairs to the balcony and look down, you can see the beautifully paneled walls. This family that's currently in here is very much preserving this particular structure. They've been working on it for a number of years. Up from the balcony, you can see the hand-hewn beams and the supporting beam of the barn in the living room. It's very interesting because the doors are split, and so we're wondering whether maybe it was a horse barn so the horse could get his head out here and get his oats and his TLC. But you'll also see these hinges and also the hardware. And my understanding from the primary literature was that they were made in Amherst by Nolan. They were crafters in ironwork, and I did a little bit of research on that, and it turns out there were 3 generations who used forges, and perhaps the gentleman who taught for 30 years, Nolan at UMass, may have forged some of these hinges. And Mrs. Fallon, who was the original buyer of this house, was very meticulous, and I just have to pass this on. She ordered 8 sliding bolts, and she knew exactly where she wanted them. 2 on the Dutch doors, 4 in the bathroom upstairs, 1 in the rear garage door, and 1 in the linen closet. She also dubbed the property the Old Timbers, and I understand from the family that they still have the original sign, and they haven't gotten to get that outside yet. But again, they're taking meticulous care of this property. We can go to Petersham, and this was Judge John Woolsey's home, and his grandson is my person who furnished my information for this building. On the left is the townhouse in Prescott, and the story goes that his grandmother and a friend were driving around Prescott, and she saw this building and said, "Wouldn't this be wonderful for my husband's law office?" So they bought the house, and he furnished me the information on this house. And it was built in 1838 by Solomon Silby, who was the carpenter, and Tukin Titus, who was the stonemason. That's when it stood in Prescott. When they brought it to Petersham, it's on the top of a hill, not easy to get to, behind his beautiful Victorian house. It was reconstructed by a family relationship who was Heathcote Wolseley. And you'll notice that the lute here, triangular lute, was moved to the back of the building, and they put a circular one here. But as I said before, almost all of these buildings, somewhere or other, they were altered. And from MDC records and Mr. Judge Woolsey's court, his law books, the old potbelly stove, and it's pretty hard to see, but this says Prescott on the signboard. And this is what the law office looks like today. Let's see. South Hadley. People may be familiar with the church. Let's see. It's a museum. It's a true Quabbin structure and was bought by Joseph Skinner in 1930. This is the first Congregational Church of Prescott. He reconstructed it board for board. According to the MDC records, he bought 4 structures. We'll talk about them more later. But when he reconstructed this, he did not put plasterboard on. He left the beams open so that you could see the craftsmanship of the years. He was a collector, and he started when he was in grade school. A teacher had them go out and collect rocks and minerals, and he just never stopped. So every place he went, he collected. And it grew from, heavens knows, from pewter to guns to, it's a fantastic museum. If you haven't been there, they're only open from May to October on Wednesdays and Sundays. But the current curator, who I met with, is doing a fantastic job. Downstairs is just as full of objects as upstairs. Also in the property, it's like a little cul-de-sac, and Mr. Skinner's idea was to create a small village. And he, to the right of the museum, stands this, and he wanted it to look like a schoolhouse. And this is from Prescott. This is a 3rd District schoolhouse from Prescott, and built this. At one time, he had a bird collection in here, which was quite extensive. It's now used for storage by the museum. I've learned that Christopher Page, they told me, this house was made from the Quabbin house of Christopher Page. I have since learned that when the MDC bought it, it was the Young's house, but I'm sure it's constructed of more than one. He also, this is on the left is Christopher Page's, the next owner, Young, and on the right-hand side is another by Adele Ryder, and his intentions were to not only build this replica of the schoolhouse, but he also wanted to build a parsonage, and I can't remember what the other one was now, and a farmhouse, but those never came to fruition. Dorset, I don't know if anybody's been there. I've been trying to get there, haven't gotten there yet. On the left is the Atkinson's Tavern. It was built in 1787. Helen Storer went in and she purchased it in 1928 and moved it to the Big E Exposition Grounds. I've also learned that in 1933 she bought a barn from Arthur Gross and had it moved to the expo grounds. Again, this is a place that I really want to get to visit. And perhaps the barn may be the nursery school now, from what I've read. I'd like to move on to Dorset, Vermont. And this is another very interesting contractor. Charlie Wade was an entrepreneur of sorts. He started a business with a horse and buggy. He married, and he and his wife bought a Victorian home. They changed it they renovated it, and it became an inn. But being very astute, he would take people for buggy rides who were staying at the inn to show them the around the Dorset area. There's a very interesting quarry up there. Anyway, he heard people talking about windows and doors from Quabbin, and I'm not sure what the total connection is, but anyway, he convinced wealthy people that this was a great opportunity to buy a house from $50 to $200 and have a summer home in Dorset. This was during the Depression years, so he kept 30 men active, taking down, numbering houses, chalking houses. He called it wrecking, putting them on a truck and bringing them up to Dorset and reconstructing them. It was only 100 miles from here up to Dorset. And this is one of the houses from Prescott, and this is Willie Turlot's home as it stood in Quabbin and was reconstructed on Barrow Heights. All of these houses tend to be on hills, so you'll have to excuse my pictures. They look like they're going to fall, but honest, they're not. It was bought from Prescott in 1930 by Lord Berwick. The picture on the left was the Sunnyside Farm. It was the home in Quabbin of Guy Stevens in Dana, and moved in 1928. Was purchased by Dr. and Mrs. Titus and erected on, as you can see, another hill on Maple Hill Road, and lovely maples on this particular drive. This is one of my favorite houses because this is the view from the front porch. So you can understand why they wanted to erect these houses on the hillsides. This one is a little bit controversial. We have some newspaper articles that this is the Enfield Chapel, and supposedly it burnt on August 1st, 1936. I have two articles, one from the People here, one from the Jones Library Archives, and supposedly the building on the right was constructed from this particular structure. However, they were incendiary fires, and one article said between Mrs. Haskell's house and the chapel, a fire was started, and Mrs. Haskell's barn and her car burnt, and supposedly this chapel, but I'm not sure. Was there enough left for Mr. Wade to bring this to Dorset to reconstruct it? Because the house on the right, which is on Route 30 in Dorset, certainly looks like this chapel. We are now looking at other towns wondering maybe if it was a different building. The house on the right was a post office brought by Charlie Wade. The family still owns it. It was a real estate office for a while and is now a pottery shop. And if we go inside, characteristic of many of the Quabbin houses are the paneled walls, the wide boards, and I'm not sure about the window back here, but anyway, if you go up to Dorset, this is a wonderful little store to go into. It's amazing what she has in there. This is the Smith Village School, and the house on the left, I'm told by my contact in Dorset Historical Society, that Mr. Wade and his workmen slept in this house. Of course, you can't number and take down a house and get it ready for transport in a day. So he and his men stayed in this home. Turns out that Sarah Lloyd bought the house later after most of Charlie's movements were made, and this is the little house on the right-hand side. It has a fieldstone fireplace. The interior, there's a book done, Quabbin to Dorset, I think, and they have a picture of the inside of this, and it is all beautiful wood inside. That's my contact up in Dorset, Terry Tyler. We often hear about the Robert Field House, which it was after that Enfield was named, and we'll hear more about that from Nancy in the future. This is the Robert Field House, but when the MDC bought it, it was Sarah Underwood's home. But this house is absolutely magnificent, sits on top of a hill again. There's an extension over here. This is the main house. Then there's a little section in here, and there's also a 3-bay garage underneath this part of the house. It's just unbelievable. No, it's not just Sarah Underwood's or Robert Field's home. There are other homes that were used to construct this. For instance, the barn of David Kennedy, and also this is a side view of Sarah Underwood's house that we saw in the other picture. Let's see. Oh, this is a view from the Field house, the beautiful mountains. They have a pond as you're coming up the hillside. My question to the gentleman who helped me with most of this was, how in the heck do you get up these hills in the wintertime? And he said they were summer homes. This house stood for 55 years in Dorset. Mr. Wade brought this one up. It's a conglomeration of 2 houses. And then in 1987, Peter Palmer moved it from Dorset to Manchester, and this stands on Union Street in Manchester. And these are 2 of the houses that were used to construct that house. The Charles Smith from Enfield and Arthur Gross from Prescott. Yes, we talked about Arthur Gross as barn as having been used. And the last house that I'd like to talk about, Charlie Wade built for his daughter this house in Dorset. It was said that Mr. Wade had Quabbin products stored in barns all over Dorset. And so he constructed this for his daughter. The base is granite. I understand the floor in the basement is also granite. The floors on the first floor are beautiful maple from a bowling alley. Again, attesting to the frugalness of these people at this particular time. And the house, exterior of the house has a lot of Quabbin, the small windows, the recessed door, the shelf over the front door. But anyway, it's a beautiful, also almost on the main street in Quabbin. And this concludes my talk, and there's so much more to learn. And at this time, if there are any questions, maybe I can answer them.
Were any of those houses moved without dismantling? The whole house?
Somebody else asked me that question, and there is a picture, and I just, right now I can't remember what magazine or what book it's in, where a house was actually on a wagon being pulled by a horse.
Right there. Right here.
Okay, all right. Yeah, here it is. I don't know whose house this is, so I assume, I know that people within Quabbin and some of the engineers did buy houses, so whether they were taken down board by board or moved in total, I don't know. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the granite steps that are sprinkled around the area, it sounds like. How did that happen? Was there an individual, an entrepreneur who went in into Quabbin and bought them and then resold them, or any thoughts on that?
My assumption is that the Gass family, like Charlie, you could buy pieces. I assume that they probably brought a whole bunch of granite slabs, brought them and used them wherever somebody might have wanted it in their construction. That's my own opinion.
Right. And when they did buy, say, a house, were they dealing with the owners of the house, or?
No, no. The MDC bought all the houses. They appraised them, they bought them.
Okay.
So it was the MDC, the contractor, the individual, whomever came and bought from Charlie Walker and the MDC.
So you're saying the average price was like $50 to $200?
Yes. Yes. I mean, that barn that Mrs. Fallon bought, she paid $25 for the first barn. $25? the first house that we saw in Amherst, that one I believe was also $50. $50. So, I mean, it was a bargain, but let's go back to the time. It was the 30s. From the 28 to 41 is the period that most of the houses and equipment was sold. Okay, thank you again.